Welcome to the Bare Metal Cyber C-Risk Prepcast. This series helps you prepare for the exam with focused explanations and practical context. Control testing is how organizations ensure their risk responses are doing what they are supposed to do. In other words, it's the only way to verify that a control is truly working. A control that exists but is not functioning provides false assurance and creates invisible failure. In other words, presence without performance means risk remains unmanaged. Testing confirms whether controls are implemented correctly, operating consistently, and achieving their intended purpose. In other words, testing closes the loop from design to result. It supports compliance, reinforces audit readiness, and helps prevent undetected gaps. In other words, testing proves that controls aren't failing silently. Testing also guides control improvements, helping risk teams know when something needs to be updated, supplemented, or replaced. In other words, testing is the diagnostic for control health. Many certifications and regulatory frameworks require formal control testing, especially for critical or compensating controls. In other words, testing is not optional in most environments. On the C-Risk exam, a lack of testing usually represents a silent risk. In other words, a missing test often means a missed risk. Choose answers that show proof of performance, not just the assumption that a control is present. Control testing serves multiple objectives. In other words, testing is not just about passing an audit. First, testing verifies whether the control actually exists and is operating as intended. In other words, it confirms the control is alive and active. Second, it identifies weaknesses in design, inconsistent execution, or missing documentation. In other words, it shows where controls break or are misunderstood. Third, it helps detect whether a control is being bypassed, circumvented, or has degraded over time. In other words, it finds silent failures and deterioration. Fourth, testing supports the reassessment of risk exposure. If a control fails, residual risk likely increases. In other words, testing helps keep the risk register accurate. C-risk scenarios often present a control that is present but ineffective. In other words, visibility without validation. Strong answers in those cases will describe what testing did, or should have, revealed. The test is not just a checkbox. It's how you know the system is actually reducing risk. In other words, testing is how assurance becomes evidence. For more cyber-related content and books, please check out cyberspace.me. Also, there are other podcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. There are several types of control tests, each designed to answer different questions. In other words, each test type serves a specific purpose. Design testing asks whether the control is logically capable of mitigating the risk. In other words, does the plan make sense? This involves reviewing the control on paper, its structure, intent, and placement within the process. In other words, is the control even built right? Operational testing determines whether the control is being performed as intended. For example, if a control requires manager approval, are those approvals actually happening? In other words, is it happening in real time? Effectiveness testing goes a step further. It asks whether the control is truly reducing risk to an acceptable level. In other words, does the control achieve its outcome? A control might exist and be followed, but if it doesn't reduce the impact or likelihood of the event, it is ineffective. In other words, it's not enough to just be in place. Testing can be manual, such as a walkthrough or observation, or automated using scripts, scanning tools, or system audits. The type of test you choose should match the control's function, criticality, and complexity. On the exam, match the test to the scenario. A detective control might require different testing than a preventive one. In other words, choose based on what the control is supposed to do. Control testing methods include inquiry, observation, inspection, and reperformance. In other words, there are multiple ways to confirm functionality. Inquiry means asking users or control owners how the control works. And this helps confirm understanding and awareness. In other words, people must know how it's done. Observation means watching the control in action, such as verifying whether someone checks IDs at a facility entrance. In other words, seeing the control happen. Inspection involves reviewing artifacts that prove the control was executed. These might include logs, approvals, screenshots, or policy sign-offs. In other words, look at the trail. Reperformance means executing the control independently to confirm the expected result. For example, if the control requires disabling a user account within 24 hours of termination, reperformance would test that action. Using more than one method increases confidence in the results. In other words, more methods give better proof. This is especially important for key controls which support major compliance requirements or high-risk areas. On the exam, combining methods is usually the most reliable approach. In other words, layered testing shows maturity. The frequency and scope of control testing depends on how important the control is. In other words, risk drives testing. Critical controls, especially those that compensate for other gaps, should be tested more often. In other words, more important means more often. Manual controls, or those that are performed infrequently, need more rigorous testing because they are more prone to failure. In other words, manual equals more fragile. Controls used daily but tested once a year are likely to fail without being noticed. Scenarios should include edge cases, exceptions, and cross-functional interactions. In other words, test the corners, not just the center. On the exam, if a control is used every day but tested only once a year, expect that to be flagged as a gap. Testing scope should reflect real risk, not just scheduling convenience. In other words, audit calendars should not dictate assurance. Control effectiveness depends on several key criteria. In other words, not all functioning controls are effective. First, the control must be reliable. It must function consistently every time it's needed. In other words, it can't work only sometimes. Second, it must be complete. It must address all parts of the risk, not just a portion. In other words, partial coverage is not full coverage. Third, the control must be timely. It must act before the risk causes damage or loss. In other words, it needs to be fast enough to matter. Fourth, it must be documented. There must be evidence that the control is active and reviewed. In other words, if it's not recorded, it doesn't count. Together, these qualities determine whether the control is truly reducing risk or just appearing to. On the exam, you may be asked to evaluate a control's effectiveness. Look for these qualities in the scenario. In other words, evidence and impact determine the score. Metrics are essential for measuring control performance. In other words, you can't improve what you can't measure. Key control indicators help track failure rate, accuracy, timeliness, and other performance factors. In other words, numbers show trends. Audit findings, incidents, or exceptions can also reveal control weaknesses. In other words, outcomes point to weak points. Stakeholder satisfaction, such as reduced complaints or improved efficiency, can also reflect control success. In other words, happy users signal adoption. Heat maps or scorecards allow leadership to view control health at a glance. In other words, visualization supports decision-making. The best metrics match the purpose of the control and are understandable to the audience. In C-risk questions, choose metrics that reflect measurable, relevant insight, not just generic reporting. In other words, pick smart metrics that guide action. Once testing is complete, the results must be recorded and reviewed. In other words, testing means nothing without documentation. Use GRC systems, audit platforms, or standardized logs to store test outcomes. In other words, record what was found. Highlight any failed or inconsistent results and escalate them for immediate review. In other words, show where attention is needed. Testing is not just a pass or fail activity. It should lead to decisions and actions. In other words, tests should trigger next steps, provide recommendations, corrective steps, or timelines where appropriate. Critical failures must be reported to governance bodies or risk committees. On the exam, if a test failed and no action was taken, that's a governance breakdown. In other words, silence equals oversight failure. Good answers will reflect escalation, action, and traceability. Failed or weak controls require structured response. In other words, you don't just note the failure, you fix it. Start by reassessing the affected risk. Residual exposure has likely changed. In other words, the environment is now riskier. Next, investigate the root cause. Was it training, system misconfiguration, lack of awareness? In other words, find the reason. Based on the cause, redesign or supplement the control. In other words, fix it properly. Do not stop after fixing the issue. Retest to confirm the fix worked. In other words, prove the problem is resolved. On the exam, look for answers that reflect a full control improvement cycle, not just issue identification. In other words, completion means reassessment and validation. The C-RISC exam presents control testing in practical terms. In other words, it's not just theory, it's execution. You may be asked which test to perform, why a control failed, what metric to use, or what to do next. If a control failed, look for design, execution, or evidence gaps. In other words, trace the breakdown. If asked how to evaluate, choose the most relevant, specific, and business-aligned metric. In other words, pick what matters most. If a test fails, the best answer will usually involve escalating, redesigning, or reassessing the risk. In other words, testing should trigger improvement. Strong responses connect testing to governance, business objectives, and residual risk, not just checklist results. In other words, the best answers prove value, not just activity. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Bare Metal Cyber C-RISC Prepcast. For more episodes, tools, and study support, visit us at baremetalcyber.com.